So what we're going to do today is talk about selection as a surface. And so what this means is that what we're saying is the coefficients we talked about last time, in particular beta and gamma, turn out to be the coefficients that describe a surface. And we're also going to talk about the way of estimating them with longitudinal data, which is subject to fewer assumptions than the cross-sectional approach I just very quickly outlined. All right. Here's our thesis. We can think of selection as a surface. We can turn down the lights so there's not glare. Which one is that? Second point, selection surfaces allow us to estimate selection parameters as well as to visualize selection. So while you're estimating the parameters that describe a surface, you're estimating those same parameters that we talked about yesterday. And the process of this visualization and estimation, we need to keep track of three kinds of surfaces. And this is probably the biggest take-home message, because these distinctions seem subtle at first, but they are going to be important to us. And I can see you're knitting, some of you knitting your brows. Three surfaces? Related. The individual selection surface, we're going to talk about that. Our approximation of the surface. This is, choose your deity. Choose your Gaia or whatever. This is the surface that only that individual knows, right? The real surface of selection out there. We need to approximate that surface in some way, and we need to realize that we're making an approximation of the true deity-given surface. And then we have this thing called the adaptive landscape, and it's related to both of these, but it's in particular related to this approximation here. Okay. And then our order of topics in our presentation today. First of all, we're going to talk univariate, and we're going to talk about the individual selection surface. We need an acronym for it. Obviously, it's going to be the ISS. And then we're going to talk about a couple of popular approximations to the ISS, one of which was originated in Vancouver. And then we're going to talk about the adaptive landscape. Again, we'll use an acronym, AL. I'll give you a few examples and some surveys. Then we're going to punch our hyper speed gear. We're going to go multivariate, but not too far, just to the two trait case. We're going to talk about multivariate ISSs, individual selection surfaces, how to approximate them, and the multivariate adaptive landscape analog. And again, fewer examples and surveys. Okay, and this is background that will help us when we do our next computer exercise moments from now. All right, the individual selection surface. Let's talk about it for a minute. It is a function of the fitness of individuals as a function of individual trait values. And we're symbolizing Landy-esque wise. Individual fitness is W as a function of Z, as a function of the phenotype Z. And we're calling the trait value the phenotypic value Z. And here's some examples. But animations are more fun to look at. And so let's see if I can, where's my cursor here? Is that what you want? No. There you go. Go to the web page. Ask Joe for his pointer. Wait, no, look. Forgot to do this. What do I want to do here? Yeah. 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 It's painful to watch me do this, isn't it?
Okay, repeat after me. I will return this pointer.
No, I've got mine. I will return this pointer. All right. Let's explain what's going on. Okay, here is the phenotypic trait distribution in blue. Here is in black the phenotypic trait distribution after selection. And actually it's the same, I think it's the same animation we saw before. And what I'm doing with the solid orange line is we're imagining that the actual, we are God, and we actually know the individual selection surface, and it's Gaussian, shown in orange. And then here in black is our approximation to it. So we've got two of our three surfaces. We have in orange the actual ISS. We happen to know it in this case, contrived. And then our approximation to it with the black line. And what we're doing is scrolling through values of, and we've standardized the phenotypic variance beforehand to be 1. And you can see that you're I love this. It's like, we can't hear Steve. We're just mesmerized by the, by the graphic. I should just shut up and let you zone out on this. At any rate, all right, I'm sorry I put that up in a way. You can watch it as long as you want later. But anyway, you get the point. So this is that what we're. Oh, you have your attention again. That animation, of course, was a pure stabilizing and or disruptive selection, depending on which way the curvature went. You notice that, and that was because we were dealing with this case and this case. The mean of the distribution before selections, it was centered right under the peak of the surface, right? All right. So the individual selection functions then gives us a way to model selection. And we can model stabilizing selection, we can model directional selection with a linear function, or by having the optimum of the individual selection function being off to the side. So this population will experience a component of both stabilizing and directional selection. So we can do a lot of things. If we put it further away, then there's going to be stronger directional selection. So it's a very flexible and useful way to model selection. But of course we're dealing with a single trait. We'll want to go into multivariate space. Okay, so next question. How is this surface, the actual ISS, related to the coefficients we talked about last time, in particular beta and gamma? Now, it's a little bit complicated, but it's not too complicated. So if we look at, now we're having to look at integrals, remember? Do you remember this? Yes. Yeah. This is the first derivative of the function, of the orange function, as a function of the variable we're looking at. Okay, so this is the symbol for a first derivative, and what we're saying here is that the beta is the average of the first derivatives of the orange function weighted by, at each position, by the frequency distribution before selection. All right, so what we're doing is to calculate beta, if we wanted to calculate, if we knew this function and we have to know both the frequency distribution before selection and the orange ISS. We have a computer, we can just calculate it by taking, here's a first derivative at this position, and we multiply that first derivative by the frequency of the trait distribution at that point, and just keep summing up those contributions, and when we get all done, of course we'll go out to plus infinity, we'll have our estimate of beta. We actually will have beta. See, I'm going to show you another animation. Help you. Okay, here we go. We're doing the integration, starting not at minus infinity, but right here. And at each point, I'm showing you what the running average looks like, right? And when we get to the end, the red is going to be the running average of slopes across the entire distribution, and it will be then tilted at the correct value of beta. Yeah. As we here, I'm showing you samples of what the first derivative of the function, squiggly w of z over squiggly z, is at each point. And at each point, what we do is we multiply that derivative by the frequency of individuals at that position, and then what I'm showing is the accumulated value, which is the integral evaluated from minus infinity up to that point.
Just to
Does that help?
yeah,
I'm just saying it again, but
if the blue curve were right in the middle, which it's not, if the blue curve were right in the middle, then
Yeah.
the slope would be sometimes positive and the other half of the time negative, and the average would come out 0.
That's right.
But because the blue curve is shifted to the left, on average, the slope averaged over that blue distribution is positive. That's
Yeah. It would be nice to have an interactive relationship with this plot, wouldn't it? But we don't have that. Any other questions? Yeah, Rosanna.
So for the people that would like statistics, could you explain us this in terms of like expected value of what distribution? Is it expected value? Is it a probability, cumulative distribution, or what is it? Or is a hybrid? What is that integral, or how would you?
Oh, what is
I don't
that
understand the distribution that we're integrating
Oh,
over.
so
I guess.
this is the distribution of trait values in the population before selection.
Okay.
Okay, it's that same blue curve that we drew before, and I've contrived it to be a normal distribution. Okay.
So it can
It
still
integrates to
have
1.
expectation 0 even when the mode is not centered in 0, right?
I'm not sure I'm following. Do you understand?
if they were normal distributions, if they were Gaussian, then it would only
the mode and the mean is the same, right?
Then having it in the center gives you 0, and you couldn't get 0 any other way. If it's normal.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you're integrating over the distribution of the relative fitness PC, right? The surface.
Right. So the integral is of the product of relative of the frequency of individuals and the slope of the orange function at that point.
Okay, so it's an expectation of the ISS given the distribution of fitness.
No. No.
I'm confused.
What is our question? Our question is, what is the relationship of our coefficient beta to the ISS?
Mm-hmm.
And it would be nice if it were just the integral of the ISS. But it's not. It's the average slope of the ISS with the slopes weighted by the frequency of individuals in the population. Okay?
Yeah, got it.
It requires, we all need to think about this. That's why I'm trying to show you, anyway. So you've got the expression, you've got the cartoon, you've got the static figure. And anyway, takes a little practice, I've got to say. All right, I'm going to, if I do this right, I think I can do it this way. Get out of there. Okay, good, I did it the right way. Okay, so that's our relationship between beta and the individual selection surface. And moving forward. Now we're ready for gamma, right? And it's slightly more complicated. So I imagine that it's Sir Isaac Newton that thought up calculus for us, isn't it? Leibniz as well. Yeah, you're right. But there must have been a wonderful moment that when Sir Isaac realized that all he had to do was integrate twice, and he could differentiate twice, and he could get the curvature of the function that he was talking about. Okay, so at any rate, that's the key to understanding what we're doing now. Let's look at the expression for gamma in terms of the individual selection surface. And now what we see, it's the same expression before, except that gamma is the curvature of the individual selection surface weighted by the frequency of individuals in the population. So just as beta is a first derivative, gamma is a second derivative, but it's a weighted average of second derivatives, curvatures. And so what we're going to do is, a simple way to see that is to plot as before the individual selection surface, and in blue, P of z, the trait distribution. And now we take the first derivatives of the surface, and before we just added them up, but now we're going to show them as a function, and that function is in yellow, right? Right? You've got, and just think about it, positive slopes here, up to this point, up to here, and then negative slopes. And of course, that's exactly what that function is doing. Here's the trick. If we take the first derivatives of this function, that's equivalent to the second derivatives of the original function. And this must have been Isaac Newton's moment. He goes, right, yes. It's not obvious, I think, but anyway, maybe for more mathematically inclined people. And so that means that's not in here, but it means that when we do it graphically, when we make our cartoon, so what we're going to show, same thing as before, but this value now is going to be the running first derivative of this function, the yellow function, and that's going to give us the second derivative of this function in orange. If your mind is torqued right now, you'll love this later, I hope. Whoops. What did I do? Oh, I know. Can't even remember my own animation page. Let's go down here. There it is. It's a cartoon just like before, but because we're doing the running average of the first derivatives, the running average of weighted first derivatives of the yellow function, that turns out to be equivalent to the curvature of the first function, the orange function. All right. I know this is far from the field. It's far from the Brazilian forest and its spiders with insects, right? But still lovely. All right, I'm just not going to spend as much time as probably would be optimal here, but okay. So the point of both of these is that that there is a relationship between the individual selection surface and our beta coefficients, and it's that relationship actually that enables us to estimate these two parameters when we when we approximate the surface. All right, and that gets us to our next topic, the approximation to the ISS. Well, so here's our problem. On each individual, we have a vector of observations of trait values. And for each individual, we have not the parameter, but that individual's estimated fitness. And remember, I need to say this again. For simplicity, we've transformed the variables so that each trait has a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. And you'll see later when we do this, our trait values, our fitness values are transformed, so they have a mean of 1. That just simplifies the meaning of these coefficients when we solve them. We're going to talk about two linear and quadratic approximations to the individual selection surface. And we can do those approximations without actually knowing what the real ISS is. And that's what we're doing when we fit these functions to our data. So here's a linear equation. It's just a straight line in the univariate case. And I've got bad spacing here, so this is beta times z. The linear form looks straightforward to you, right? Here's the intercept. This is the slope. And so with this approximation, you can think of us as estimating beta, a parameter of interest, by just fitting a simple linear regression to the data. Voila. So that's nice. We can also do a quadratic approximation to the surface, which means we have a second term in squared values of the trait. And this coefficient here is miraculously gamma. This gives us our best estimate of gamma. And we've got this peculiar 1/2 out here. Normally you wouldn't have it. This looks like a familiar second order polynomial or quadratic approximation. If we put a coefficient of 1/2, that makes gamma equivalent to a second derivative, which is useful for our purposes, because that's what gamma is. We know from the algebraic expression I showed you a minute, the calculus definition of gamma. And we'll talk about these two expressions later and actually use them in our computer exercise later today, so they'll look a lot less mysterious when we play with them for 45 minutes. And I'm going to come back to them in a minute. But the point we're making is that with our data on individual fitness, we can estimate beta and gamma regardless of what the ISS looks like. Without knowing what it is, we can show that this is our best estimate of those two parameters. So that's nice. There are other ways to, oops, you want to go back, Arnaud?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What would be the measure of fitness, for instance, with the spider's webs? This would be the survivor, so it's 0 or 1.
Yeah.
But then should it be normally distributed or Gaussian, or it can be binary?
It can be binary.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Not obvious, is it? There's lots of discussion of this in the literature. But we will talk about this more if you want. Yeah, it could be. So this works irrespective of whether the fitness measures are binary, continuously, whatever the distribution of W of Z. All right, so there are other approximations. So if you think about it, the last approximations, I'm not going to contrive an example. You'll see them in this paper by Dolph Schluter. It's unlikely that just fitting a straight line is going to be a good approximation to whatever that surface is, right? And yet it gives us our best estimate of beta. It's not that impossible to think about, because after all, beta is just the average first derivative of the function, whatever it is. At any rate, if you want to actually visualize, if you want to approximate the surface as it actually appears, then there are better ways to do it. And a good way to do it is, one way to do it is the cubic spline approximation that was described by Dolph Schluter and co-author in a paper on both univariate and multivariate approximation. So here's for example some data, and this is a binary example, Arno. And you see here there are just two fitness values, either 0 or 1. And if you fit a higher order, essentially we're fitting a higher order polynomial, here it is here, and then here are our confidence interval about it. We have most confidence, or tight confidence, in the region of the curve in which we got a lot of observations. But it's certainly not linear, and it's certainly not quadratic, right, a simple parabola. So if you're an ecologist and you're actually interested in the bumps and grinds of what the actual surface might look like, and Dolph is, because he studies selection in Galapagos finches, and for example, and that might be a reflection of resource, seed availability on Daphne. You're actually interested in, this might represent one seed, not in this, another kind of nut. That might or might not be true. Okay, so this gives you a more realistic approximation of the surface, but you can't use it to estimate the parameters, right? So if you're interested in both, you want to do, maybe a cubic spline or some higher order function, but you still probably, if you're interested in beta and gamma, you want to do the linear and quadratic approximation to estimate the parameters of selection. Question? Mingxi?
I want to ask a really stupid question.
No.
So far,
no stupid questions.
So far the WZ function we see is a curve. So where does the surface come from?
Oh,
Does
in
that
the
come from
univariate
one?
case, it's
Okay.
just a simple, It's just a simple line.
Okay.
But when we go to 2 characters, when we have a trait coming out of the board, then it's going to be a two-dimensional surface. But we're calling this a surface. This surface here in the black solid line is our approximation to the ISS. And we're calling it a curve even though it's just a line. Is that okay? Okay. All right, now let's talk about the adaptive landscape. So the individual selection surface, whether we're talking about the true one or our approximation to it, is a function of individual fitness values as a function of individual trait values. The adaptive landscape, which we need for evolutionary problems, is a function of the average trait value in the population. Okay, let's think about what we're going to do later. Later in the course, for this beginning tomorrow, we're going to be interested in the evolution of population and species means, right? And so when now in single trait space or you're plotting average trait values, right, as a function of time, or as a, typically it's a function of time, or as they evolve on. It's not individuals, it's averages that are evolving, right? All right. So I'm waving my hands, but it's from that point you can see that we don't want the individual selection surface. We actually want another surface, the surface of average fitness in the population as a function of average trait values, right? So when you talk about the evolution of means on a surface, it's not evolution of means on the ISS, it's the evolution of means on some other surface. And that other surface is the adaptive landscape. So what I just said is we're interested in a surface W bar. Sometimes we take the logarithm of average fitness as a function of the average trait value, W bar. All right? Okay, now take a second deep breath. We're asked the question, what is the relationship of beta and later gamma to this new surface, the adaptive landscape? And the answer is, it's very simple. If we knew this surface and evaluated its first derivative at the mean of the population at W bar, that would be equal to beta. We're actually going to standardize by the average value of fitness here, right? So that's why this is equivalent to, here it is here. This is also equivalent, getting rid of this W bar. That's equivalent to the first derivative of the logarithm of W bar as a function of Z. So this, I'm sorry, this is just helps if you're into calculus, and if you want to see the actual expression that we would use when we're actually programming, you're going to need that. What's the relationship of gamma? It would be nice if that were true, right? If the gamma was the average, the second derivative of the adaptive landscape evaluated at the trait mean. But it turns out you need this little correction term, a correction for directional selection. And I don't think I can give it a good intuitive reason for that. It's just that this drops out of the algebra, and maybe by next year I'll have a good intuitive explanation for that, unless someone wants to volunteer one here. Maybe you will later. Okay, so I'm letting you come back and look at this. So here's the point. Well, we'll get to that point. Okay, so we made this point before. We're interested in the AL because this is the surface on which species and trait means are going to be evolving. And if we want to, so now let's suppose we want to do computer simulations or diagrams of that evolutionary process. We want to actually think about and calculate the evolution of traits on the adaptive landscape. In general, the adaptive landscape for an ISS is a difficult function to evaluate. But in the particular case of trait values being normally distributed and the ISS being Gaussian in shape, we can readily calculate the adaptive landscape because it turns out to be Gaussian as well. Now, if you think about a bell-shaped curve and you're saying, Steve, this is crazy. You're gonna have a selection surface that's like a bell curve. It seems like a weird shape. But if we're talking about weak selection, we're talking about the center of the bell curve, and it's expanded out. So it's actually very close to a quadratic function. It's just a very shallow curve. And so essentially, if you want to go think about the real world, this use of a Gaussian function is most appropriate when we're thinking about relatively weak stabilizing selection. So we're sort of restricted to that case, actually. We're sort of focusing on that case. All right, and this is just these are just our results. So if we have a normally distributed trait, this is the definition for a normal distribution. Remember, this is our P of Z, the trait distribution before selection. Here's its mean. Here's its variance. Standard correction term, so that integrates to 1. Seen it for the first time? Don't trust me. Google the normal distribution. This function should come up. Okay, if we say that the Gaussian ISS is Gaussian, then we're saying this. Okay, that's definition. This is definition. If those two things are true, then the adaptive landscape is also Gaussian with these parameters. So when we look at the Gaussian adaptive ISS, omega here is playing the role that variance in the trait before selection played in the normal distribution. But remember, this function is not a probability distribution. It's not a normal curve. It's a Gaussian function, right? Fitness is a function of trait value. So this can't be a variance, right? This omega is like a variance, and it's defining the width of the function. Okay? And likewise, when we look at the adaptive landscape, it's omega plus p. And Matthew can probably see this derivation. It's actually a few steps, but it's not hard to show that I guess this is a convolution of Gaussian functions, I think. Oh, you're happy with that, Rosanna? Okay. And so you can, with or without knowing anything about convolutions, you can show that this, if you say this and this, then this follows, which is simple and lovely. Sophia.
It's probably very naive question, but where did the numerator go in the equation for fitness curve for WZ? Why don't we have the square root of 2 pi?
Oh, why don't we have this?
Omega.
Why don't we have this thing?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have this thing for a normal distribution because we want that function to integrate to 1. Right?
All right.
Right?
Okay.
In other words, you want all the probabilities of trait values to add up to 1, if you think of it. But here we don't care about that, and so we can just use this function without the normalization. Joe's going to make a comment.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I agree. And the nice thing about the second line is that when you're at the optimum, the fitness is 1, and that's kind of a nice standardization. The highest possible fitness in that case is scaled to 1.
Rosanna in the back row.
So maybe this answers Sophia's question. In W bar, like the mean fitness where it's not the square root of 2p, is because that symbol is approximately. And really that square root of 2 pi p doesn't contribute anything to the fitness. It's a constant relative to the fitness. So it doesn't matter. It's just like a scale, but it does not contribute to the final fitness when you're integrating.
Good. Any other?
Another way is to say that line is relative fitnesses, and the relative fitnesses are taken relative to the fitness 1 at the peak.
Right. Okay. I may not have those points in the notes at the bottom of the slide. Probably not. So we do want to take our time with this stuff because you may not be able to figure this out later. Okay. So now now we're looking at the properties of an adaptive landscape under the condition that we said. Let's suppose the ISS is Gaussian, the trait distribution before selection is Gaussian, and hence the adaptive landscape is Gaussian. Certain simple properties follow. So, for example, if we look at if we look at beta, this is true. We've already talked about that. It's the first derivative of the W bar, or actually ln W bar function. Beta also takes the simple form. It's the deviation of the trait mean from the optimum divided by omega plus p. Now, why have I written it this way? Why am I doing that? You can guess. That is going to be the expression in the multivariate case as well if we write it this way. So we've same, and likewise the second derivative, which is this, not just gamma, is equal. It also takes a simple form. It's the negative inverse of omega plus p. And those are handy. This can be handy formulas and very simple ones to use. Let's see. So it's a little hard to visualize what the adaptive landscape in the Gaussian case is relative to the individual selection surface. But remember, the width in one case is omega, in the other case it's omega plus p, and p is a variance. It's always positive. So if you think about it, the adaptive landscape is always going to be a flatter version of the individual selection surface. And it's going to have the same peak. It's going to have the same optimum. Just, if you see in a Gaussian individual selection surface, it's often sufficient to say, well, it's going to be a little flatter. And usually if omega is large, that is to say selection is weak. Remember we were using 49 yesterday? Then the individual selection surface is going to have a fitness like a variance of 49, but the AL is only going to have a width like a variance of 50. It's not going to, they're barely going to be distinguishable, right? So the weaker selection becomes, the more and more does the adaptive landscape approximate, it's very, very similar, approximates the ISS. That's just simple thing to remember. Okay, so let's look at surveys in the univariate case. So we've talked about gamma. We've talked about omega. Gamma is the negative inverse of omega. So if we have, in the literature, there's a lot of empirical estimation of gammas. We can convert all of those values to a distribution of omegas with that approximation, which is accurate, especially when there's weak selection. But in any case, what we see is a distribution that tends to be split on either sides of 0. So this is omega. Remember, it's a Gaussian function. This reinforces the point that omega is not a variance because we've got positive and negative values. When the values are negative, the function is bowed up like this, and when it's positive, the function is concave. All right? And you can see there's a preponderance of values close to 0. That means that the function is extremely flat in many of the empirically estimated cases. I'm blasting on because we've got to get to the multivariate case. There's also a formula that we can use. This doesn't require the approximation, the assumption of a Gaussian individual selection function. From our estimates of beta and gamma, we can estimate if we're in a stabilizing selection sphere, we can estimate how far the trait mean is from the optimum. And you can see when we do that, now here I've taken the empirical studies which actually showed concave selection acting on the population. Take all of those cases and say, well, how far is the trait mean from the optimum? And you can see it's a negative, almost a negative exponential function away from the optimum. So most populations are very close to their optimum. We can conclude from this survey of 197 cases of stabilizing selection. And if you ask, what two are those studies saying about the width of the adaptive landscape and its relationship to the trait mean before selection? So I've rescaled things. So here's the average trait distribution before selection scaled so that it's got a mean of 0 and a width of 1, a standard deviation of 1. Then what we see from that last survey is we're about, on the average, 1.1 phenotypic standard deviations from the optimum, and the adaptive landscape that's where the optimum is, and the adaptive landscape is, I can't remember the value exactly, you can see it in the caption, it's 2 or 3 times as wide as the trait distribution. All right, let me look at I'm trying to speed up here and I'm getting out of breath. All right, let me look and see what we got here. Where are we? 9:45. Yes, I just finished 5 minutes ago. All right. But our discussion goes to 10:15. So let me see if I can wrap in 10 minutes. We will sprint through the multivariate case. All right, the multivariate case. Okay, here is a hypothetical value, and I think this is probably a case of weak stabilizing selection that's actually Gaussian. But now we're talking about, instead of a curve, Mingzi is happy now because this does look like a surface. And so this is bivariate stabilizing selection. And we're going to need at least a matrix to describe it, right? Because it's curved in 2 dimensions, and then we need the whole orientation of that surface. Here are now some examples of this shows you my conventions. Here we've got, this is a little easier to see this one. Here's a bivariate trait distribution before selection, and I'm showing you the 95% confidence ellipse. And you can see, where's P? I guess I don't show P here. But in any case, there's no phenotypic correlation, hence it's round, and the 2 traits apparently have the same variance. And in fact, their variance have been scored to 1 in both traits, as we've always done in showing these figures. And then here's the trait distribution after selection. The mean is changed, and also the variance is contracted in both traits. And there is apparently no change in the covariance because they're both perfectly circular. And the ISS that did that is shown here in orange. And what I'm showing there is, it's not really a 95% confidence limit. It's some other value, but I've just shown an ellipse so you get a sense. I guess it is the 95% confidence. I'm just showing you the shape of the surface. Remember, it's Gaussian, right? So we can use the same formula that we use for Gaussian trait distribution to calculate the 95% confidence ellipses. So it gives us a nice picture. And you can see that there's no orientation in the surface, as there is in this case, right? So here's the omega matrix. It's a little hard to see. You might have to look at your screen. It's 2 and 2 instead of 1 and 1 in the case of the blue distribution. And there's no off-diagonal element. Okay, so there's stabilizing selection, we can tell, because the coefficients are positive on the diagonal, and there's no off diagonal. Okay, so here's think about this one. This is an orange individual, or in orange, the individual selection surface. Here's omega, 2 and 2. That's the same coefficients of stabilizing selection on each of the traits. And then what's this off diagonal element? It is the orientation of the surface. It's positive, so the surface is tilted in this direction. If they were negative, then it would just be pointed in that direction. Just conventions that will be useful. And I'm not going to play the animation, which you can click, which will then rotate, as we did before in the univariate case, between different values for the individual selection surface. Just a way for you to relax and zone out, build your intuition. All right, so let's do this really fast. I'm not even going to go over there, right? From what we said before, there's a straightforward extrapolation to the bivariate case, which is what we're going to show to illustrate the multivariate case. So now the first derivatives of the individual selection surface, this is without the Gauss, with no assumptions about its shape. The first derivatives are, as a matter of notation, are going to be like this. The second derivatives are going to be a matrix with those on the main diagonal showing the curvature in the two trait dimensions, average individual trait dimensions, and then the off-diagonal elements showing you the orientation of that whole surface. Here's our same expressions as before. Beta is an average first derivative, but in the bivariate case, it's going to be a column vector. And gamma is going to be a 2 by 2 matrix. Same expressions as before, just to... Yes, I like to see those nodding heads. Let's all nod our heads, regardless of... Got it. All right, now we'll take some time to talk about this, because we're going to use this later today. Okay, so now, a way to estimate beta and gamma, irrespective of what that actual surface of selection is to use a linear approximation. And we're just going to look at, so here's the general expression for the linear approximation with multiple traits. And now here's the bivariate special case of that multivariate expression. And you can see we're fitting, now we've got two traits, Z1 and Z2. We're going to fit two slopes. This is actually the equation for what? When we were in the univariate case, this same expression was the equation for a line. What is this the equation for? A plane, a simple plane, so that's not going to be a very good approximation to to that. For example, suppose the God-given selection function was that orange wedding tent that I showed you. Not going to be a good approximation. But this is the expression we will use, and we can show in general that it is the best estimation for the two betas. We could estimate a function, if we want to estimate the curvature of the tent, we can use this expression here, and I've left out a term. Where is that? See, there should be a Z right here. Where's that marker? Let me just put that in there. Where's Eric? Okay. No, I'm not going to do it. But now in the bivariate case, at least I didn't leave it out. Okay, so look at the bivariate case. This is the example of a quadratic surface in two dimensions. There's a, if we just did that, that's the flat line, and then we have three terms that are give us curvature. Gamma 1, 1, that's the top diagonal entry in the gamma matrix, is going to give us the curvature in the Z1 trait dimension. We use squared terms. This term is going to give us the curvature of the surface in the Z2 trait dimension. See the squared term? And this term, which we're going to call with coefficient gamma 1, 2, the off-diagonal elements in the gamma matrix, it's going to be the product term, and it's going to show us the orientation. It's going to change the orientation of the surface. So we're going to do this in the computer exercise. I'm going to give you an example of data on in which for each individual we have two trait values, Z1, Z2, individual fitness. We're going to fit this function to estimate beta, and then we're going to fit this function to get estimates of gamma, the three gamma terms in the gamma matrix. And we're going to talk about why we need to do it in 2 steps this afternoon in the exercise. It's a sort of tedious reason why we do that. Okay, so quadratic surface, it's just a simple thing, right? Well, you know, it actually, and we're thinking of sort of the weak version oftentimes with this surface, but there are a lot of different kinds of situations that you can approximate or fit with a simple bivariate Gaussian surface. Depending on your choice of coefficients, it can be a peak, a simple dome with a peak. It can be a saddle. The surface is bending up here and down in that way, so there happens to be a saddle. We can have a level ridge or a rising ridge. So even with just 2 traits in this very simple function, we can have a variety of possibilities. Okay, so remember we pushed the knob from univariate to bivariate. Are you ready to go to? No, we're going to go to 3. Are you ready to go to 3? Does anyone want to go get another cup of coffee? Okay. All right, so now we have 3 dimensions. We have a trait value this way, a trait value that way, and a trait value this way. So this now is a sphere floating in trivariate space. See it? See it? And the optimum is right at the center of the onion. And then there are these layers coming out from that. So that's the trivariate stabilizing selection, and there are these rising nested cones and saddles. This is the one I like, which I hadn't thought about. It's the tube in 3 dimensions, which is saying that the optimum is not a single point, but it lies along a line going through trivariate space. And anywhere along that line has equivalent and optimal fitness.
Would that connote that third variable doesn't really determine fitness?
The direction, well, I've aligned it with one axis here, right? But it needn't be aligned with any of these axes. But good point, Dave. This is aligned with that. So it's saying that trait is not affecting things. But in general, it can be oriented. There could be a dimension in which you're free to evolve. And that's an interesting thing to think about. It's one of those things that enlarges your imagination that you would never really, it's not really in our, think of your textbooks, right? The textbooks don't go to the 2 variable case, right? None that I know of. So in 3 dimensions, there's no discussion of this in our undergraduate and graduate training. That's why you came to NIMBioS. I'm being overly dramatic, but there's a lot to be gleaned from the multivariate case.
Could your tube or cylinder actually be a snake? In other words, twisting like that, so that different trait combinations give you equivalent fitnesses?
Pat, no realism here, please. We don't want realism.
Well, I thought Steve would appreciate the snake analogy for obvious reasons, but then I was thinking about different trait combinations as well.
Not only do I appreciate it, Pat, but you've blown my mind. Because I'm thinking, could it be possible that vertebral numbers of snakes could evolve along the axis of an undulating tube in 3 dimensions? Yeah. I want to say yes, but I'm not sure. I'll have to think about that. That's exactly the kind of conceptual vistas.
Would you get an undulating tube in?
We've got to move on.
But quadratic. If you had a
ahead.
quadratic approximation, I don't think you could get a.
Those are quadratic.
Yes, they are. But like, could you get an undulating?
I think snakes themselves are undulating tubes.
Yeah.
We're at least cubic and maybe quartic. Matthew will tell us about that at the break. All right, we've got to move on. Okay, so here's a cubic approximation. Again, this is the same argument as before. If you're really interested in the shape of the thing, not just estimating coefficients, you'd want to do something like this. Is a really interesting example. This is human birth weight. So this is gestation period, birth mass, and it's this wonderful symmetrical, well, it depends on the scaling, but it's a nice bivariate stabilizing selection surface. But and I would look at it and say, well, you did a good job with a cubic. I'll bet a quadratic surface would actually be pretty good for that. Just as before, our coefficients, beta and gamma, provide a little window on the adaptive landscape. They tell us the first derivative and the second, what the first derivative and the second derivative are at the trait mean. Now, I have colleagues in the literature who've criticized the whole program here, saying, well, the adaptive landscape is this incredible, conceptual thing that nobody can ever estimate or see or anything. Well, that's not true. I mean, we can't see the whole adaptive landscape, but we can know about its first and second derivative at the trait mean, and that's more than nothing. Boy, there's a weak statement. Okay, but it's a lot more than nothing. All right, so the same points we made about the adaptive landscape being computationally accessible and so forth in the univariate case apply in the multivariate case and also in the bivariate case. So these are the same expressions just taken to let's see, what have I done here? I've given you the general expressions, yes, and then I'm showing you what omega and omega plus p look like in the bivariate case. I'll let you look at them later. I guess we need to talk about this. So unfortunately, this lecture was out of sync with, we should have done this before Adam's lecture. So what I'm showing you here is, here, for example, let's look at this. Let's skip right to this one. Here's an individual Gaussian adaptive ISS, and here are the coefficients. So here it is as a gamma surface. Here it is as an omega surface. So this is like the approximation of the Gaussian surface with a quadratic function. And then if in the Gaussian case, if we go to with the Gaussian surface, we can actually draw the adaptive landscape. And that's what the surface would look like. And we can find the major axes of these surfaces by taking eigenvalues, taking the eigenvalues and eigenvectors. And as we'll see in our exercise, in R, that's very easy to do. Whatever the matrix is that you have, whatever the symmetrical matrix, these are in the cases we're going to be dealing with, you just go eigen, put in the name of your matrix, and you get out a little table with all the eigenvectors and eigenvalues. So it's hard to do in your head, but it's very easy to do in R in whatever the dimension of your problem. Okay, so here are a couple of examples. This is an interesting case of garter snake data set by Butch Brody at the University of Virginia. And I'm not going to go into it. It takes a while to explain. But the snakes, when they escape from a predator, some of them crawl away in a straight line. I guess that's what they're doing at this end of the distribution. Or at the other end of that trait distribution, they tend to reverse rather than go in a straight line. And that turns out to be correlated in the selection surface with how striped the snake is. In other words, this is the individual selection surface estimated by having data on survivorship in the field as a function of these two traits. And it turns out to be one of these interesting saddle shapes. Here are two more garter snake examples. This is a case of growth rate in the field as a function. You can't see this body vertebrae and tail vertebrae. Here's the case that we're actually going to look at. We're going to look at the data that gives you this surface. This is the body vertebral count, tail vertebral count in newborn garter snakes. And the fitness surfaces aren't really fitness. They're crawling speed in the 1 meter dash, which I'll argue is a probably linearly related to fitness. And we get a satellite function. Now, what confidence do we have in this surface? One way to do that is to calculate the confidence intervals or the standard errors for the coefficients in our quadratic regression, right? Another way to do it visually is to bootstrap over this sample and draw the surface, estimate the surface with each boot, each iteration, each boot sample, and then draw the function. And if we do this rapidly, as we can in R in a kind of crude, we'll see what the surface looks like. And if we had high confidence in the surface, it should just waver like this. If there's really low confidence, it should flap like some crazy butterfly or something. So we'll do that this afternoon. Here's a survey of approximations to individual selection surface, quadratic approximations, and we've rotated the axes so we can think of the first two major axes of these surfaces. And what you see is saddles are extremely common, much more common than bowls, that would be bivariate disruptive selection, or peaks, which would be bivariate stabilizing selection. And if you have an intuitive reason for why that's so, it would be good to publish it, because I think a lot of us are still scratching our heads about what nature is telling us here. Okay, what have we learned? Geez, we're almost out of time. Okay.
I know you're out of time. What was that? I
Yeah, you wanna go
think
back?
the one thing one could say about saddles is they can't really be true if you go out far enough,
Yeah.
because the fitness will go off to infinity. So
Right.
it has to be a local thing.
Yeah, they're always local. And of course, you saw this in Schluter's approximation with the cubic function, but our confidence of the surface, is very good close to the mean, and then as we go further away, we have less confidence. And we're fitting these functions that go anyway. So maybe it's not too surprising, but we can talk about this more later. It's actually, I think, an interesting result that deserves discussion that we don't really have time for at the moment. Okay, so 3 big takeaway messages, and they're simple. We can describe selection with a surface. And for those of us that are visually oriented, this is a really compact way of thinking about selection. Directional selection is always your distance from the optimum. The curvature is telling you about stabilizing selection. And we get this new thing, correlational selection, that comes out of the bivariate and any other multivariate case. Okay, so some approximations of the true selection surface allow us to estimate key measures of selection. And I argued today that those key measures are beta and gamma in our discussion today. And they're key for a number of reasons, but in particular, they give us this little window on the adaptive landscape, which is going to be the surface that's going to concern us when we're interested in evolution across a generation or two, and especially for long periods of time. And we'll talk about that in a lecture coming up later. And then there are a whole series of references here. Here's Schluter. Here's the Blows and Brooks article that talks about surface. Here's Schluter doing cubic splines in 1 trait, 2 traits. Here's a garter snake example. Here's another garter snake example. Do I have Brody here? That's too bad. And then here's Kingsolver et al., which is one of those survey papers. Okay, and I think I've done it again. But I won't even try and argue that you gobbled up the time with your questions. I can't say that. We have 5 minutes for discussion. Questions? I wish I should have left more. Arnaud?
Yeah, so we saw the case for the 3-dimension, but I guess if you have a higher number of dimension, then it starts to be quite complex. So is the right approach to use the principal component analysis and decrease the number of traits by using PC1?
It's one
PC2?
solution, and I'm actually kind of fond of it. Okay, so here's the problem. You have your data set. Here's the problem. If you've got a lot of traits, you're going to have a lot of dimensions, and you're going to have a lot of coefficients to fit. And the number of gamma coefficients is going to go up as a square of the number of traits, right? So it becomes a huge number. And now you're estimating a lot of things with a limited amount of data. So unless you've got a selection study based on hundreds or thousands of individuals, you're going to face a problem unless you've got just a couple of trait dimensions. So there are various solutions, and one shortcut is to say let's rotate the original trait space with principal components and just look at variation along the first and maybe the second, maybe the third trait dimensions. The common complaint about that is that if your traits are linear, probably the first principal component is going to be something like overall size. And then, 2 and 3 are going to maybe be some shape. But sometimes they're very hard to interpret. And so a lot of people say, well, yeah, you can do it, but now you're off in some fantasy world of linear combinations of your traits that don't make sense. But this is a point of, I wouldn't call it controversy, but of angst in the literature, of how to handle the dimensionality of your surface or your analysis when you've got limited amounts of data. Now, I'm sorry to say that what a lot of people have done in the literature is just estimate betas, right, and forget about the curvature of the surface. But I find that very unsatisfactory because the betas are just telling you about maybe the direction towards the optimum, and they're not telling you anything about stabilizing selection or correlational selection, and you're not really using your data to ask important questions about the mode of selection. But there's no simple answer to your question. But yes, principal components, you could try that. But my only suggestion is to consult the contemporary literature and see how people are struggling with this. But it's the problem of you're just going to run out of statistical power in the face of trying to do a big complicated surface. Okay, yeah, Sophia.
So I wonder if my intuition is all wrong, but would a saddle surface imply some sort of disruptive selection, so that you can, it means, am I right to think it means you can have completely different trait combinations with equal fitness? So you can have many optima in terms of phenotypes.
Well, but yeah, so let's go back and let me go back a couple. So here's why we're worried about saddles. It's this Blows and Brooks survey showing us that if we look at the first two principal components of the trait distribution, we see saddles in many cases. So as Joe is pointing out, this is just a local analysis, and so we really only know have a reasonable glimpse of what the surface looks like in the vicinity of the mean. And we're fitting very simple functions. They come down in the quadratic case, or they go up. And here's the other thing that we need to point out is that if selection is very weak, the difference between downward curvature and upward curvature is very, very slight. And we're going to see this in the example we'll look at. When we look at the garter snake case, the point estimate of might show downward curvature of the surface in one dimension, but on bootstrap samples, it's very easy to go boop, up, so you're going to go, doot, 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 doot. And so I think this is what's going on here. I mean, you're saying that surfaces, often you get one dimension going up and the other going down, but those are the point estimates. And I think probably a better takeaway message here is, by and large, bivariate selection surfaces are very slightly curved. And this is one possibility. So sometimes they're up, sometimes they're down. Often one is up and the other's down. And that's yeah. So it doesn't mean that we're discovering disruptive selection in the classical, one trait picture that we learned in our textbooks.
Large selection is weak, it would seem.
Yeah, that's what I think is our main message. Remember when I showed you those distributions of curvature coefficients, and they were clustered in the omega case, they were clustered about 0? That's saying the commonest thing is to have a very, very flat or slightly up or down surface. So it's just, Other questions? Yeah, Matthew?
Yeah, I was wondering for slide 20 if you could.
I don't have numbers in this view, but tell me when I'm there.
Where Part 6, approximations to the multivariate ISS.
Is this it?
I think back a little bit.
Oh, yeah, that one?
Right.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could explain the terms for the quadratic approximation again.
Yeah, okay.
Didn't really pick that up.
Okay, so let's go out here and just, they're a little hard to read here, but can you see them on your screen? We're going to talk about those three terms. Okay, so one point to make is that a compact way to handle this in matrix algebra is to put these gamma terms into a gamma matrix. And there are three coefficients. There's gamma 1, 1 on the diagonal, gamma 2, 2 on the diagonal, and we've got this off-diagonal element, gamma 1, 2. And so when we write it that way, we're always referring, in the multivariate case, then you've got, it's bigger. Okay, so when we look at these, though, there are three terms. The first term with a coefficient gamma 1, 1 is describing the curvature in the trait 1 dimension. And if gamma is negative, that's the opposite of omega, the curvature is downward. If it's positive, then the curvature is upward. And that's true for trait 2 out here, trait 2, gamma 2, 2. These are the coefficients for the squared trait values. So this is just a standard convention for fitting a quadratic surface in two variables. Now we've also put a coefficient, we put a value of 1/2 in front, and so we point this for the reason that if we do that, then this coefficient gamma is a second derivative. That's a little bit obscure, but it's handy for the theory. That's also true for, of course, for the other term for the other trait. But notice that we don't have a coefficient of 1/2. This is a second derivative, off diagonal second derivative in the multivariate case without putting a coefficient in front of it. This coefficient is a little bit harder to think about because now we're in two dimensions. With just these two terms, we can describe whether the surface is round and curved up or down, or whether it's like a cigar that's curved up or down. But what this term, the gamma 1, 2 term does is tell us whether the cigar or whatever is tilted up or tilted down. Now what gamma is doing also is it's describing the effects of selection on the covariance. So that if gamma is positive, it's describing the case that selection is tending to increase the correlation between the two traits. So so think of it that way, gamma 1, 2 is implying that the surface is tilted upwards in the trait space. A negative gamma 1, 2 is describing that the surface is tilted down. Okay, so in general, those are the rules for interpreting the coefficients. Are you ready for the... There's always these little surprises in... I have to find this for you. So in general, those are the rules for interpreting gamma. But as a matter of fact, to actually visualize the surface, you can't just look at the values of the coefficients. Because look at these four surfaces that I've shown here. This is a hypothetical case drawn by Pat Phillips in a paper we did together. These are four very different surfaces, right? They've all got gamma 1, 1, gamma 2, 2, gamma 1, 2 coefficients, but these surfaces differ generally in the second decimal place in the values of those coefficients. A very slight change can not only, as we're talking about, convert a bowl into a dome, but it can also flip you from here to here, and just very slight changes in these. And so in general, there are two ways to interpret the surface from the coefficients. One way is to just plot it, right? Just go in, give it to R and say, hey, plot this, draw me a picture of this surface. The other thing to do is to do a principal components analysis, and then you can interpret the curvature along the major axes. And from that, you will get you will get a visualization of it. But not very many of us can do a principal components, a rotation of axes in our heads, and so So the general rules that I gave you are correct, but you can't read off the shape of the surface from your fit.